Welcome back to Nothing But the Truth with Trudy. I'm your host, Trudy Stern. Tonight, the clock is ticking. Iran is negotiating. Washington is maneuvering. Bibi's in the White House. Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states are watching closely. And inside Iran, the Ayatollah is crushing protesters with bloodshed in the streets. Is this a breakthrough moment or the calm before the much bigger? Is this enrichment capability or about missiles, drones, and regional domination? And what happens next doesn't just affect Israel. It affects America. It affects the Middle East. It affects the balance of power in the entire world. Returning to Nothing But the Truth is Ambassador Yoram Ettinger, former Minister for Congressional Affairs at Israel's Embassy in Washington and longtime advisor on U.S.-Israel strategic relations. He is known for cutting through the headlines and focusing on long-term strategic realities, the kind that shape history, not news cycles. Ambassador Ettinger joins us now to help us understand where this is headed and what the real implications are. Ambassador, welcome back to Nothing But the Truth.
Thank you very much. My pleasure and my privilege to be on your show.
So let's dive right in. Tell us where the negotiations are right now with regard to Iran.
Well, first and foremost, the whole notion of negotiation needs to be analyzed. There are two dictionaries involved. One is a Webster dictionary, which is employed by the US administration. And according to the Webster dictionary, negotiation is a means or step towards eventual reconciliation, agreement, peaceful coexistence. But then there is also the Middle East dictionary, or more specifically, the Ayatollah dictionary, which is about 180 different than Webster dictionary. And according to the Ayatollah dictionary, negotiation is a means to lick the wounds of June 2025 when they were badly hit by the Israeli Air Force and then by the US Air Force. It's a step to stall time, which allows the Ayatollah regime to restore capabilities, to upgrade capabilities, and get ready for the next offensive against the so-called apostate Sunni regimes in the Middle East, and eventually to hit the infidel West, and especially the great American Satan. Negotiation in principle are interpreted by the Ayatollah regime as an indecisiveness on the part of the US, as a sign of potential weakness on the part of the US, because if the US were indeed a superpower, which it is, if you're a superpower in the Middle East, you don't offer negotiation. You bring your enemy to submission. And for the US to refrain from bringing the Iranian regime to submission to produce regime change has been interpreted by the Ayatollah as a potential sign of weakness and therefore tailwind for their own anti-American policy. And here again, contrary to conventional wisdom, the Ayatollah regime is not consumed only with their megalomaniacal aspirations in the Persian Gulf or in the Middle East or parts of Africa. They harbor fanatical aspirations as dictated by their 1400-year ideology, as emphasized by their 1979 constitution, their classroom curriculum. They are consumed with a global aspiration, especially the great American Satan, and part of it is the network of sleeper cells controlled by Iran as terror sleeper cells, which are stretched throughout the United States, awaiting a green light coming out of Tehran.
So that's really a great point that you're bringing up, that Iran is absolutely an enemy of the United States. Most people think that Iran is really an enemy of Israel. They're focusing on Hamas and Hezbollah and the proxies against Israel. But let's delve in right now about the attacks against the United States and these sleeper cells that are all over the United States. Could you explain that?
Certainly, recently there have been testimonies on Capitol Hill by the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, the Director of National Intelligence, and Homeland Security are in agreement as expressed in their 2025 threat assessment that anti-American Islamic terrorist cells on U.S. soil controlled by Iran's Ayatollah in collaboration with Russia and China are in fact threatening and aiming to hit previous American officials, current American officials, and in fact afflict the US with a dramatic hit going back to November 2023 and then February and April of 2024. Then the director of FBI intelligence also indicated in a series of hearings, House and Senate Appropriations Committee, subcommittees on Homeland Security, and authorizing Homeland Security committees. And in each one of those four hearings, the FBI director indicated that October 7, 2023 has inspired anti-US Islamic terrorists controlled by Iran to repeat similar acts of terrorism on US soil. And the most natural front to carry out an October 7-like terror acts against the US is the US-Mexico border. The reason has to do with a very tight collaboration between the Ayatollah regime and every single drug cartels in Latin America. Drug trafficking is an arm of foreign policy, just as terrorism for the Ayatollah regime is a branch of their foreign policy. And in fact, when it comes to the US, the Ayatollah regime, which took over control in February of 1979, started to initiate anti-American activities in Latin America at the beginning of 1980. And why have they chosen Latin America? What do they have to do with Latin America? The Ayatollah regime policy mandates them to bring the great American state into submission. According to the Ayatollah regime, Latin America is the soft underbelly of the United States. Since the beginning of 1980, in collaboration with Hezbollah terrorists, they started to forge close ties with every single anti-American Latin American government. They have established terrorist training camps in Latin America, especially in the tri-border area of Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil, another tri-border area of Chile, Bolivia, and Peru. Those two tri-border areas have been for decades lawless areas, paradise for terrorists, drug traffickers, human traffickers, and money launderers. Hezbollah has been deeply involved in that due to the very large number of Lebanese immigrants who settled in Latin America, many of them Shiites, some of them sympathizers of Hezbollah, some of them extremely successful mega millionaires, few are also billionaires, involved in drug trafficking, involved in money laundering. A feature of the Ayatollah's foothold in Latin America used to be Venezuela. Venezuela was the number one beachhead of the Ayatollahs in the most northern spot in South America. The reason they chose Venezuela had to do with Hugo Chavez and then with the Maduro regimes, but primarily due to the strategic importance of Venezuela, very close to the US base in Guantanamo, Cuba, not too far from Florida, not too far from the Panama Canal, which connects between the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean. And the Ayatollah regime established in Venezuela a major area testing ballistic capabilities. And in addition, 20% of global oil reserves are in Venezuela. Iran benefited from that, China benefited from that, and Russia benefited from that. The US operation against Maduro in Venezuela has changed the global balance of power, depriving Iran, Russia, and China of a major beachhead which potentially could have afflicted the US with major negative consequences on US soil.
You've laid out a very complicated, complex agenda that Iran has. You've made it very clear that it isn't only a nuclear program that is a danger to the world. And you've also made it very clear that this is a problem for the United States. I think that the way that you laid it out is so critically important for us to hear because most people just think that America is stepping in to help Israel, but that isn't the case here at all.
Absolutely. And an example is the fact that for many years, Iran has supplied the drug cartels with equipment to construct underground tunnels between Mexico and California, Mexico and Arizona, and Mexico and Texas. And the reason is that they, along with the drug cartels, have employed such tunnels to smuggle into the US not only drugs, but also terrorists. And when it comes to drugs, we all are aware of the roughly 150,000 American youngsters dying every year due to consumption of drugs. Much of it comes from the US-Mexico border, and the Ayatollah regime has played a major role in boosting the traffic of drugs into the US. Drug trafficking is much cheaper than producing missiles, and they realized that through drug trafficking, you can cause the US much damage, which has severely undermined homeland security.
Well, I'm hoping that our government is taking into account the severe dangers that Iran poses to our country. And that is one of the motivating factors in what they're going to do with regard to Iran going forward. Is that your belief also?
I hope that being businessmen, which Trump is and some of his key advisors are, they would follow the practice of businessmen when contemplating future steps or new partners. You first conduct due diligence of the track record. When you examine the track record of the Ayatollah regime, you find out, for instance, that the anti-US operation by the Ayatollah regime hasn't started with Maduro or Hugo Chavez. It goes back to 1982 when the US was afflicted by Hezbollah and Iranian involved terror operations where car bombs hit the US embassy in Beirut, the US Marine headquarters in Beirut, responsible for the murder of some 270 Americans. Then there was the case in 1998 with two car bombs, each one hitting US embassies, one in Kenya, one in Tanzania, and once again, the Ayatollah regime and Hezbollah were involved. It has been the policy of the Ayatollah regime since day one. Let's not forget that the Ayatollah regime owes its ascension to power primarily to the US. It was a US administration which stabbed the Shah of Iran in the back. The Shah was the American policeman of the Gulf. But then President Carter and his national security advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski stabbed the Shah in the back and ushered in Ayatollah Khomeini, whom they viewed as an old man in exile in Paris, aspiring for human rights to the Iranian people. They went as far as referring to Ayatollah Khomeini as an Iranian edition of Gandhi. President Carter, addressing world leaders 10 days before Ayatollah Khomeini returning to Iran, assuming power, assured them that based on American intelligence, Ayatollah Khomeini was expected to be preoccupied with tractors, not with tanks. Those were the words of President Jimmy Carter. And then what was the reaction by Ayatollah Khomeini? They took over the US embassy in Tehran. They held 50 Americans hostage for 444 days and transformed Iran from the American policeman of the Gulf to the #1 epicenter of anti-American terrorism, anti-American drug trafficking, anti-American money laundering, and anti-American proliferation of advanced military systems. And the question is, does President Trump and his advisors conduct due diligence? The track record of the Ayatollah regime from day one, February 1st, 1979 until today, have proven through their actions that neither negotiation nor economic sanctions are the ways to deal with the Ayatollah regime. The only way to rid the world of this major epicenter of anti-American terrorism, drug trafficking, and money laundering is through regime change.
That's a tremendous question because the United States has not been very successful when it got involved with regime change, as we could see from Jimmy Carter's huge blunder, which is why he's considered one of the worst presidents ever. Do you think that that is what is happening here? That the negotiations and the stalled negotiations are a tactic for President Trump to be able to get all his ducks lined up so that we can have an effective attack against Iran? Is that your belief?
Could be. In fact, we noticed that before the June military offensive against Iran, very few dared expressing an opinion that President Trump was going to join the Israeli Air Force offensive against Iran. He did that in defiance of very close allies of him from among the isolationists, in defiance of some very substantial contributors to his campaign. He did that because he could not ignore reality, and he proved himself as a person who is willing to learn from experience. Hopefully, the same thing will happen now. There are some people around Trump and possibly Trump himself who still believe that maximum pressure, economic sanctions could do the trick, because economic sanctions could break down the Iranian economy. I hope they don't follow this path, because economic sanctions have been part of US policy towards Iran since Jimmy Carter, after Carter realized his horrendous mistake facilitating the rise of the Ayatollah regime. He imposed tough sanctions on Iran. President Trump imposed maximum pressure sanctions on Iran during his first administration. But we know now in hindsight that neither negotiation nor economic sanctions have left a dent on Iranian policy towards the US. It hasn't induced them to become good faith negotiators or to abandon their fanatic ideology. And therefore, it behooves the US to refrain from repeating the mistakes of economic sanctions and negotiation towards Iran if President Trump wants to advance his noble aspiration to end wars. You cannot end wars while the chief epicenter of wars and terrorism, drug trafficking, is still in action. In order to end wars, you have to uproot the chief epicenters of war. Now, I'm aware that in Washington, throughout the US, there's no appetite for regime change due to the failure of past experience. I understand there are people who are concerned about the cost of such a step. But my message to anyone who is concerned about the cost of regime change is to contemplate the fact that refraining from regime change is going to pave the road to a nuclear Ayatollah regime. And a nuclear Ayatollah regime would not be just another nuclear regime like China and Russia and North Korea and Pakistan and India. It would be the first ever apocalyptic nuclear power in human history. And an apocalyptic nuclear power would then bring upon humanity catastrophic cost which would dwarf any cost which we contemplate today under the worst case scenario of bringing about regime change in Iran. Regime change in Iran would bring salvation to the vast majority of the Iranian people. Regime change in Iran would remove the Ayatollah machete from every single pro-American Arab regime throughout the Middle East, all the way to Northwest Africa in Morocco. Regime change would expand dramatically the circle of the Abraham Accords. Regime change would deny Russia and China of a major foothold in an area which harbors 48% of global oil reserves. Regime change would advance dramatically the U.S. posture of deterrence, and as far as President Trump, regime change would bolster the Trump legacy, and the opposite is also true. Refraining from regime change could register President Trump as a president who denied the U.S. a potential of a very mighty posture of deterrence, producing major tailwind to anti-American Islamic terrorism, anti-Western Islamic terrorism.
You've given us a lot to think about, and I guess in the next couple of weeks, we might see something major unfolding. And I do hope that whoever has the ability to make decisions watches this podcast and hears your words. I'd like to zoom out for a minute to the other Arab states that are watching closely. Saudi Arabia. Can you tell us about their position and why they are speaking out the way they are?
We have to notice the difference between the Saudi talk and the Saudi walk. In the Middle East, there is a saying which reflects the Middle East of the last 1400 years. On words, one does not pay custom. And if you don't pay custom on words, why not use it, employ it as widely as possible for domestic reasons and international reasons? The Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia played the major role behind the Abraham Accords, irrespective of the fact that there is no peace treaty between Saudi Arabia and Israel. But without MBS, there wouldn't be Israel peace treaty with the Emirates, with Bahrain, with Morocco, or with South Sudan. In fact, while there is no peace treaty between Israel and Saudi Arabia, there is very advanced cooperation between Israel and Saudi Arabia along defense lines, irrigation, agriculture, and high-tech lines. The Crown Prince has been aware that when it comes to facing the deadly threat of the Ayatollah regime and the Muslim Brotherhood, he cannot rely on any fellow Arab country. Sometimes, and only sometimes, he can rely on the US, and even that is not very secure. However, when it comes to Israel, he can rely on Israel as being a systematic and effective ally in the face of the Muslim Brotherhood, in the face of Iran, and therefore he has collaborated with Israel without having an official peace treaty. Moreover, the Crown Prince is eager to free his country from the energy reliance economy. He knows that energy reliant economy will not last forever. He wants to develop self-sufficiency in other areas, most importantly, technology. And when it comes to technology, he knows he has no better ally or partner than Israel. While all that is going on as far as the Saudi walk, the Saudi talk usually is very different. And the problem is that Western media pays much attention to Saudi and Arab talk, less attention to analyzing Saudi walk, because analyzing the walk takes many pages or many minutes. And today's media is determined by seconds, not by hours, which are required to study the walk. One more example is the Saudi attitude towards the Palestinian issue. We keep hearing, not so much from the Crown Prince, but especially from his foreign minister, we keep hearing statements saying a prerequisite for Saudi peace with Israel is the establishment or a major step towards establishing a Palestinian state. Well, the question is, what about the Saudi walk? And when we examine the Saudi walk, and by the way, the Arab walk as a whole, since 1948, the establishment of Israel, we find out that no Arab country has taken any effective step in order to advance the cause of a Palestinian state. And the question is, why haven't they done that? The answer is very obvious if we invest the time to study the Palestinian Arab walk. The Crown Prince is aware that in the 1950s, the Palestinians collaborated with the Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt, hunting, terrorizing their Egyptian host, which forced them to run away from Egypt to Syria. In Syria, they collaborated with the Muslim Brotherhood of Syria, terrorizing the Syrian host, which forced them to run away from Syria to Jordan. In Jordan, they attempted to take over control of Jordan, topple their host, the Hashemite regime, which triggered a very vicious civil war inside Jordan, the Black September of 1970, which forced them to run away to Lebanon. They plundered Lebanon from 1970 through 1982, causing series of civil wars, causing rampage throughout Lebanon until they were expelled from Lebanon in 1983. And then came the big-time treachery by Palestinians of their Kuwaiti host when the Saddam Hussein invasion took place. Kuwait at that time was the #1 Arab hostess of Palestinians, absorbing 400,000 Palestinians, allowing them to rise to top position administratively and business-wise. But when Saddam Hussein invaded and plundered Kuwait, the Palestinians collaborated with Saddam Hussein, which was the reason. Once Sheikh Sabah, the leader of Kuwait, was reinstated by the Americans after the first Gulf War, the first thing it did was expelling almost all 400,000 Palestinians. And the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, who is a very smart man, asked himself, should I speculate about future Palestinian conduct while I have all the track record in addition to Palestinian collaboration with Nazi Germany, with the Soviet bloc, with North Korea, with Venezuela, with Cuba. Why should I do something which would add fuel, not water, to the Middle East fire? And therefore, the Crown Prince, just like every other Arab leader, they showered the Palestinians with embracing talk. But as far as the walk, it's anywhere from indifference to very, very negative, which has basically transformed the Palestinians into a role model of intra-Arab terrorism, intra-Arab subversion, and intra-Arab treachery.
So, final question, and it is this talk or walk, as you just explained, that Saudi Arabia is urging the United States and President Trump not to attack Iran. Why would that be so?
Well, it's another form of talk. The Crown Prince doesn't need me or anyone else to clarify to him that when it comes to Ayatollah regime, they view the toppling of the apostate Saudi regime as a top priority. Not only is it apostate from their religious point of view, but Saudi Arabia controls the two top religious sites of Islam, Mecca and Medina. The Ayatollah regime claims to be the leader of the Muslim world. It's very difficult to be the leader of the Muslim world while somebody else controls the two number one sites for Islam. Moreover, Saudi Arabia is a major competitor with Iran over much of the global oil reserves. The Iranians claim much of Saudi oil. In Saudi Arabia, the number one oil region is the Eastern Province. Eastern Province is mostly Shiites, and the Ayatollah regime, it realizes that the Shiite population of the number one oil region in Saudi Arabia is a potential ally, and therefore they are involved with subversion and terrorism in that area. The Crown Prince is aware of it. But why not say something for domestic consumption and intra-Arab or intra-Muslim or global consumption, while when it comes to eyeball meeting, which I assume the Crown Prince has held such meetings with President Trump, I would be shocked if the Crown Prince did not mention to President Trump, I want you to know that I highly appreciate you authorizing me to buy $1 trillion worth of military systems. I know that it will be great for Saudi Arabia to be allowed to invest in the US $2 trillion. But I want you to know the big time prize for Saudi Arabia would be removing the Ayatollah machete from my throat. And the only way to remove the Ayatollah machete from my throat is through regime change. Negotiation plays into the hands of the Ayatollah, perpetuates their regime, legitimizes their regime, providing them with tailwind, which threatens my own existence. I have no doubt that the president heard about it, and if he hasn't heard it from the Crown Prince, he certainly has heard it from the leadership or the command of CENTCOM, military command of the Middle East and the Persian Gulf, and certainly from the Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu.
Wow. Okay, Ambassador Ettinger, what you've made clear tonight is this. Things are very complex and very interconnected, and that the decisions being made right now will echo far beyond this moment. It will shape Israel's security, America's strength, the future of the Middle East. And thank you so much for giving your insights and for coming back to Nothing But the Truth.
Thank you for providing me this podium. Thank you so much.
To our listeners, thank you so much for joining us. This has been Nothing But the Truth with Trudy Stern, with our very special returning guest, Ambassador Yoram Ettinger. You can catch us every Thursday at 9:30 p.m. on the radio But if you missed any part of this show or want to listen to any of our past episodes, you can find Nothing But the Truth wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, stay strong, stay informed, and keep seeking nothing but the truth.